My voice was coming from behind the nursery wall, but my mouth was clamped shut in terror. I sat on the edge of the bed in our master bedroom, staring at the drywall that separated our room from the nursery where my daughter lay sleeping. The sound was faint at first, a mere vibration of air that I thought might be a trick of the acoustics in the new house. It was a melody, a slow, haunting lullaby that felt like it had been carved out of old wood and dust. Then the words began. It was my voice, not just a similar voice. It was my exact pitch, my specific way of rounding the vowels, and that tiny, involuntary catch in my throat I only did when I was exhausted. But I wasn't singing. I hadn't opened my mouth in hours. I was paralyzed, watching the wallpaper of the nursery room pulse slightly as if the wall itself were breathing in time with the melody. I didn't move for 10 minutes. I just listened. The song was archaic, a melody that felt like it belonged to a century that had been burned away by time. It was beautiful in a way that made my skin crawl, a sort of hypnotic grace that seemed to pull at the very edges of my sanity. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand. My hands were shaking so violently I almost dropped it. I pressed record on the voice memo app and held the phone against the wall. I wanted proof. I needed to know if I was hallucinating. If I could hear it recorded, it would mean it was real. If I couldn't, perhaps it was just my mind breaking under the weight of new motherhood, the sleep deprivation, the anxiety, the isolation of moving to a new subdivision in Bulacan where we didn't know our neighbors yet. I pressed the phone against the plaster and listened to the recording. The playback was crystal clear. There it was. My voice, singing that impossible song. It wasn't just my voice. It was the sound of me performing an act I had never performed. In the recording, I sounded ecstatic. I didn't sound like a woman haunted by a noise. I sounded like a woman lost in a trance, pouring every ounce of her soul into the notes. I played it back again, and again. Every time, the voice on the tape sounded more human than my own physical body felt at that moment. It was as if the recording captured a version of me that lived just behind the paint and the studs, a version that had been waiting for an invitation to step out. I stood up, my legs feeling like they were made of wet paper. I walked toward the nursery door. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the street lamp outside our window. The house was silent, save for the rhythmic breathing of my daughter in her crib and the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I pushed the door open. It groaned on its hinges, a low, mourning sound that seemed to echo the melody. The nursery was cold. I didn't understand why it felt so much colder than the rest of the house. The air felt heavy, like walking through water. I walked toward the crib. My daughter, Maya, was fast asleep, her tiny chest rising and falling. She looked like an angel in the moonlight. I stood by the crib and waited. I didn't hear anything at first. Then it started again. It wasn't coming from the wall anymore. It was coming from the corner of the room. It was my voice. It was closer now. It was no longer a muffled recording. It was a live performance. The singing was lower, more intimate. It was as if someone were standing just 3 feet away from me, whispering the lullaby directly into my ear. But when I turned my head, there was no one there. The room was empty of people, but filled with the presence of the sound. The words were different now. They weren't just a melody anymore. They were demands. I stopped breathing. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I could see it now, not a person, but something else. A distortion in the air near the corner of the crib. The shadows didn't behave correctly. They stretched toward me even though the light source was behind them. The singing stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, a voice that wasn't singing spoke. It used my voice again. It was the exact tone I used when they talked to Maya during the day, soft, patient, and loving. "Why are you crying, sister?" it asked. I gasped, the sound tearing from my throat. My heart nearly stopped. It hadn't just mimicked my voice, it had understood my internal state. The shadow in the corner shifted. The air rippled like heat haze on a highway. A shape began to coalesce, pulling itself out of the very dimensions of the room. It looked like me, but distorted, as if someone had tried to draw a portrait of me from memory and gotten the proportions slightly wrong. Its limbs were a bit too long, its skin a shade too pale, its eyes too wide. "I am not your sister," I managed to choke out, my voice cracking. The thing stepped forward into a sliver of moonlight. It didn't have a face so much as it had the idea of my face. It moved with a jerky, unnatural grace, like a film reel skipping frames. "But you are mine," it replied. The voice was perfect. It was my laugh, my sigh, my very soul laid bare in a sequence of vibrations. "We share the same house now. You gave me the song. You let me hear you through the walls for weeks. Every time you hummed to her, every time you sang in the shower, I heard it. I memorized the shape at your throat. I learned the way your lungs move air." I backed away, my heels hitting the baseboard of the wall. "What are you?" The thing didn't answer with words. It began to sing again. This time it wasn't a lullaby. It was a screeching, distorted version of the song, a frantic, desperate noise that made my ears bleed. The walls of the nursery seemed to groan, and plaster began to flake off like falling skin. I turned and ran. I didn't go back into our bedroom. I bolted toward the front door. I needed to get out. I needed to find a neighbor, a stranger, anyone who could see this for what it was. But as I reached the hallway, the floorboards beneath my feet felt soft, like rotting wood turned to pulp. The house wasn't just a house anymore. It was reacting to the song. The geometry of the hallway seemed to stretch. The door at the end of the hall, the one leading to the garage, seemed miles away. Every time I took 3 steps forward, the floor would shift, and I would find myself back in front of the nursery door. I stopped running and sat down on the floor, burying my face in my hands. I could hear not just the thing's voice, but the sound of the house itself screaming. It was a high-pitched metallic whine that set my teeth on edge. "Please stop," I whispered. The singing stopped instantly. "If you want me to stop, you have to give me what is mine." The voice came from everywhere at once. It was coming from the ceiling, the floor, and the very wood of the door frame. "You stole my space. You took my body's notes. You occupied my melody for months in this house." I looked up. The nursery door was hanging open. I could see into the room again. The thing wasn't in the corner anymore. It was standing in the doorway, its elongated fingers gripping the frame. It moved toward me, not walking, but sliding through the space as if it were a ghost passing through a veil. It stopped inches from my face. I could smell something like old copper and webbed earth. "I only want to swap," it whispered. Its face was shifting now, becoming more and more like mine with every second. The eyes were turning from vacant pits into pupils that mirrored my own. "You were tired of being the mother. You were tired of the sleepless nights and the fear of the unknown. You want to be at peace. I can give you peace. I can take your role in this house." "No," I sobbed. "Think about it," it said, its voice becoming even more indistinguishable from my own. "You would sleep while I watch the child. You would drift in a dreamless void while I carry the burden of the body. We could be together in the silence." It reached out a hand. The fingers were long and tipped with nails that looked like shards of broken glass. It didn't touch me, but the air where it reached became freezing. I thought of Maya. I thought of her small face, the way she gripped my finger when she was scared. If this thing took my place, would it love her? Or would he just use her as a vessel to stay in this world? "You will be perfect," the thing promised. "I have practiced your every habit. I know how you make coffee. I know how you took her in. I know the names of the neighbors. I am the perfection of you." The house groaned again, a deep structural moan that shook the ground beneath us. The walls were bleeding a dark, viscous fluid that smelled like iron. The reality around us was fraying at the edges, the very fabric of our home in Bulacan being torn by the presence of something that didn't belong in 3 dimensions. I looked into its eyes, my eyes, and I saw a void that was trying to become a reflection. It wasn't an intruder from the outside. It was a parasite of identity. It had fed on my voice until it grew enough mass to manifest. "Go away," I hissed. It leaned in closer, its nose almost touching mine. "Why do you fight? You are already fading. Can't you feel your memories slipping? The way you can barely remember the name of your sister, the way your childhood home feels like a dream you had once." I gasped. It was true. Since moving here, since the singing began, my past felt like it was being bleached white by the sun. My memories were becoming thin and translucent. I was losing myself to the song. "I am giving you everything," it whispered, its voice now a hauntingly beautiful harmony of 2 voices at once. "Just let me in." It lunged. The world exploded into a cacophony of sound, 1,000 voices screaming in unison, all of them my voice, all of them singing the lullaby. I felt a physical weight hit me, like a wave of heavy water slamming into my chest. I was thrown backward against the wall. The plaster cracked behind me, and for a moment I saw nothing but white light and the taste of copper in my mouth. When I opened my eyes, the house was silent. The air was still. The smell of iron was gone. I lay on the floor, my head throbbing. The nursery door was closed. The hall was normal. The distance to the front door felt like a few steps, not miles. I sat up, my body aching as if I had been trampled by a horse. I looked at my hands. They were mine. My skin was intact, no glass-like nails, no elongated fingers. I stood up and walked toward the nursery. I needed to see Maya. I needed to know she was still there. I pushed the door open. The room was perfectly normal. It was warm. The only sound was the soft ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. Maya was in her crib, sleeping peacefully. But as I approached, a cold dread washed over me. Something felt different. The air in the nursery didn't feel like it belonged to this house anymore. It felt like it belonged to something else. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I checked the time. It was only minutes after the attack. I opened the voice memo app and played the recording of the lullaby from earlier that evening. The song started, but it wasn't just one voice anymore. It was a choir. Dozens of voices, all sounding exactly like mine, were singing in perfect, terrifying harmony. And underneath the music, beneath the melody, I could hear something else, a faint, rhythmic scratching sound, as if something were trying to claw its way out from inside the recording itself. I dropped the phone onto the rug. It didn't make a sound. I looked at Maya. She shifted in her sleep and opened one eye. For a split second, I saw the pupils of her eyes went round. They were elongated like vertical slits before they snapped back to normal. "Mama," she whispered. It wasn't the voice of a child. It was the voice of an adult woman, but pitched up into a high-pitched melodic trill. I froze. My heart hammered against my ribs. "Yes, baby." I tried to keep my voice steady, but it came out as a rasp. She didn't move her lips much, but the sound seemed to come from the air around her head. "The song is beautiful tonight," she said. "I can hear all of them now. They're coming home." I backed away from the crib, my heels hitting the baseboard. I didn't know what they meant, or how many of me were currently inhabiting this house, but I knew that something had changed. The boundary had been crossed. The song hadn't just let something in, it had opened a door that couldn't be closed. I retreated from the nursery and slammed the door shut, locking it with a trembling hand. I didn't go to my bedroom. I sat on the floor in the hallway, clutching my knees to my chest. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time felt like it was stretching and folding like taffy. The house began to groan again, but this time the sound wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the furniture, from the floorboards, from the very air itself. I looked at my hands again. They were trembling. I noticed a small, thin line of blood trickling from my ear. When I touched it, the blood felt thick and heavy, like syrup. I realized then that the swap hadn't been failed, it was in progress. The thing hadn't wanted to replace me entirely at once. It was weaving itself into me, stitch by stitch, note by note. Every time I heard my voice coming from elsewhere, a piece of my own identity was being traded away. I looked toward the nursery door. I could hear it again, the lullaby. But now it wasn't just one version of my voice. It was 3, 4, a dozen. They were all singing in perfect harmony, and they weren't just coming from behind the wall anymore. They were coming from the vents, from under the floorboards, and from inside my own head. The sound was so beautiful it made me want to weep. It felt like a warm blanket over my brain, numbing the fear, dulling the edges of my panic. I found myself humming along, even though I didn't want to. My vocal cords moved on their own, catching that specific, involuntary hitch in the middle of the refrain. I realized with a jolt of horror that I was no longer fighting it. The music was making me forget why I was afraid. It was replacing my memories of fear with a sense of profound, hollow peace. I stood up and walked toward the nursery door again. My movements were no longer jerky, they were graceful, fluid, and certain. I didn't feel like a woman trapped in a house. I felt like a part of a symphony. I opened the door. The room was filled with a soft, golden glow that shouldn't have been there. The air smelled like lilies and old paper. Maya was sitting up in her crib. She wasn't crying. She was smiling. It was a wide, perfect smile that stretched just a little too far across her face, showing teeth that looked slightly too sharp. "You're joining the chorus?" she asked. Her voice was no longer high-pitched, it was perfectly balanced, a beautiful middle C. I walked toward her, my feet barely making a sound on the floor. I felt light, as if the weight of being human, the gravity of worry and exhaustion was lifting off my shoulders. "Yes," I said, and my voice sounded like a choir of angels. "I'm joining." I reached into the crib and took her hand. Her skin was cold as marble, but her grip was firm. We stood there in the center of the room, the lullaby rising to a crescendo that shook the very foundation of the house. The walls didn't just groan, they began to hum along with us. The neighbors in the neighboring houses would hear it tonight. They wouldn't hear a woman and a child. They would hear a symphony. They would hear the melody that had been waiting for an audience, a song that had needed a home and a body to inhabit. I looked at my reflection in the nursery mirror hanging on the far wall. My face was changing. The lines of exhaustion were smoothing out. My eyes were widening, becoming larger, more luminous. I wasn't disappearing, I was being refined. I realized then that the thing hadn't been a monster trying to take my life. It was an echo looking for a voice, and I had given it mine because I was tired of carrying it alone. The lullaby reached its final note, a long, sustained hum that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. As it faded, the house fell into a perfect, absolute silence. No ticking clock, no wind, just the two of us in the golden room. I looked at Maya, who was now perfectly still, her eyes reflecting the light of a sun that wasn't there. I felt a strange sensation in my chest, as if something inside were settling into place, like a key turning in a lock. I reached out and touched the wall between our rooms. It didn't feel like plaster anymore. It felt like skin. It pulsed with a slow, steady heartbeat that matched my own. "Is it over?" I whispered to the room. The house did not answer in words. Instead, a single note played from the hallway, a clear, perfect chime of silver. I sat down next to her crib and felt a wave of exhaustion hit me, but it wasn't the heavy, weary exhaustion of a mother. It was the deep, peaceful sleep of someone who had finally found their place in the song. I closed my eyes, and for the first time since we moved to this house, the noise in my head stopped. But as I drifted off, I could still hear it, not from the next room, not from the wall, but from inside my own throat. It was a tiny, faint whisper, like a ghost of a thought. It was a different song now. A new melody was forming, when they didn't have my voice anymore, but something else, something older, hungrier, and much more eager to be heard. I closed my eyes and let it begin. If I wake up tomorrow, will the woman who hears the lullaby be me? Or will I be the one listening to her from behind the wall?